All right. Well, thank you for the psalm this morning. We will be going to Exodus chapter 1. We finished the Gospel of Matthew last Sunday, and so we are beginning a new series, the study of Exodus. So this is sermon number 1 in this series, entitled "Hello, Israel, I am still here." Exodus chapter 1, we're going to be looking at verses 1 to 7. Now these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man and his household came with Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. So what is the world most worried about in 2024? Well, at least according to one survey, these are the top 10 global worries right now, and in order. Number 1, inflation. Number 2, crime. Number 3, poverty. Number 4, unemployment. Number 5, political corruption. Number 6, healthcare. Number 7, climate change. Number 8, immigration. Number 9, taxes. And number 10, education. So these, out of the numerous countries that people that were surveyed, these are the top 10 worries today in the world. Now, if you're like me, you're surprised, perhaps even shocked, that nowhere on this list of global threats and fears is worries about invasion by foreign shepherd kings. Didn't even make the list. Now, maybe that doesn't seem like such a remote possibility today, but it did actually happen in ancient Egypt. Now, the details are a little bit sketchy, and that's true of a lot of history in the early millennia. But the Hyksos were a group mostly believed to be Canaanite origin shepherds who moved east into Lower Egypt and became the first dynasty of foreign kings in that nation's history. Now, some modern historians think that the term invasion might be a bit dramatic, and they propose that the reality was more peaceful than that, and the Hyksos only became villainized later in Egyptian purist propaganda. Well, whether it was the actual history of the Hyksos or the revisionist propaganda history of them that did it, the Hyksos did seem to contribute to what Moses referred to in Genesis chapter 46 and verse 34, the fact that the Egyptians had a disdain for foreign shepherds. They were an abominable, detestable people to them. Now, this little historical artifact actually plays quite a vital role in the history of Israel and the book of Exodus that we are beginning to study. So this book, Exodus, has God speaking and acting in very direct and dramatic and public ways as much as any book in the Bible, maybe even more than most, and maybe even the most of all, I'm not sure. But this little fact from Egypt's history plays a crucial role and shows God's hand in all of history, not just in private mountaintop revelations. You see, Egyptians were unbelievers. They didn't know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, nor did they believe that they owed anything to him. And so they never thought of him as the creator of that nation and as the author of their history. Well, today we start a study of this book, which starts with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Joseph all dead. But God is still here, and his word lasts more than a lifetime. What do you think of the book of Exodus? Um, there are some books as a preacher, and I've throughout most of my ministry, I've preached through books of the Bible. And whenever I would get close to one, oftentimes people would ask, oh, what book are you going to next? And if you say something like Revelation, well, they all jump for joy. You say something like Exodus, say, oh, sorry to be such a disappointment. Do you find Exodus boring? Do you think of Exodus as a bunch of laws and priests' clothing and tabernacle stuff, and really just does it seem irrelevant? I remember talking to a man years ago at work, and he was complaining about his church's Sunday school curriculum that at the time was going through the book of Exodus. And he asked why they should care about what happened to Israel thousands of years ago. And he thought that they needed to be much more relevant and current and focused on today, which was several years ago then. He thought they should be talking about the Clintons and Ron Brown and FBI files. And I know to some of you that means absolutely nothing, but that does date that conversation just a little bit. That's what he thought they should be more concerned about. Why are we talking about this stuff from thousands of years ago? Well, I certainly hope you're not going to hold my feeble efforts against this book in any way. And maybe, though, we need to look at this book just a little bit more closely. Listen to the way that Leland Ryken described the book of Exodus. Exodus is the greatest adventure story ever told. After long centuries of slavery under Pharaoh, God remembered his covenant with Israel and delivered his people out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. The story of Israel's salvation has everything that anyone could ever want in an adventure story: a cruel villain, Pharaoh; an unlikely hero, Moses; fantastic disasters, the plagues; a spectacular deliverance, crossing the Red Sea; a long journey through the wilderness; a mountaintop experience where Moses receives the Ten Commandments; and a grand finale when God comes down to fill the tabernacle with his glory. Along the way, as we might expect in an epic adventure, there are unexpected setbacks and unpredictable delays, magic tricks and miracles, feasts and festivals, music and dancing, and many close encounters with the living God. Well, that's a very compelling description, and I don't think I can live up to it, but I do hope that it at least gives you some interest in studying this great book. As we want to start, first of all, with just sort of a big picture of Exodus, and then we will look at verses 1 to 7, which actually form sort of an internal introduction to this book. Well, Exodus is the second book of the Bible. It is the second book of Moses, the second book of the Pentateuch. Moses wrote this book, and he wrote this book, obviously, sometimes after the events of the book. Most likely written during the 40 years in the wilderness before entering Canaan. Probably can't be any more specific than that. He was an eyewitness to most of the events of this book, as most of them happened in his lifetime. Now, the primary audience for this book was actually not the people that this happened to, but was to their descendants. The primary audience for this book was actually that second generation of Israel who would enter into the land promised. Exodus has 40 chapters, 1,213 verses, 25,957 words, making it a little shorter than Genesis. It's about 81% of the length of Genesis. It takes a little under 3 hours to read straight through. Exodus is a book that is often quoted and referred to by other books. In fact, it's the third most quoted or referred to book in the New Testament, and it is the fifth most quoted or referred to book in the entire Bible. Exodus is a book of historical narrative. In other words, the major genre of this book is recounting to us historical events that happened in Egypt, in the wilderness, with the people of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So there are numerous notable events in the book, like the birth of Moses and his early life and his calling and his leading of Israel. There's the actual exodus from Egypt, including the plagues and the Passover and the crossing of the Red Sea. There's the giving of the Old Covenant at Sinai and the building of the tabernacle. And one of the things that you're first going to notice about Exodus when you begin reading it is how that it is a continuation of the account from Genesis. Chapter 1 covers a time period of about 300 years. So it's a very brief summary. Chapter 2 covers about 80 years. And then from chapter 3 through chapter 40, the end of the book, all of that happens in probably a little over a year's time. Exodus reveals many things to us about God and about God's attributes. This book, perhaps more than just about any other, reveals God's sovereignty over believers and unbelievers alike, God's sovereignty over Israel and God's sovereignty over Egypt, and really God's sovereignty over all of his creation. This book reveals much about God's holiness. And again, when we think about the Old Covenant, and we've recently studied the Old Covenant in quite a bit of detail, think about how that reveals the holiness of God. Also, God's wrath and judgment are revealed in this book as he acts against the nation of Egypt and against their gods. This book also has quite a few typical pictures in it. So when you think about the book of Exodus, it actually supplies much of the vocabulary that we have for talking about redemption and ultimately salvation. There's a redeemer. There's a redemption of Israel from Egypt. There's a Passover lamb that is sacrificed with the blood shed. There's the bread from heaven. There's the tabernacle. There's the priesthood, and there's the high priest, and on that we could go. And think about how often these things, these images are referred to throughout the rest of the Bible, and obviously teach us much about salvation. So as we think about this book, we can divide it a number of ways, but a simple division of this book would be chapters 1 to 18, which give us the account of Egypt to Sinai, and chapters 19 to 40, which give us the account of Israel at Sinai, which is where they are for all of the remainder of the book. All right, so let's begin to look here at Moses' own introduction to this book, which is really what the first 7 verses of chapter 1 give us. Verse number 1. Now these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man and his household came with Jacob. So these verses, again, form sort of an internal introduction to this book. And they give us the setup of what is going to follow. They give us the connection with what came before and the continuity with what came before. So when you think about the book of Genesis, well, sometimes we refer to Genesis as the book of beginnings, which is what Genesis means. The book of beginnings, the book of origins, and we read there about the creation and the nations and all sorts of things. And Genesis especially gives us, sometimes we say the history of Israel, but maybe it would be a little more precise to say that it gives us the origin of Israel. And then when we turn to the book of Exodus, we're really getting the beginning of the history of Israel. And spoiler alert, the history of Israel is given to us throughout all of the rest of the Bible. Beginning here. Again, origin in Genesis, beginning of this nation in Exodus and their history, and ultimately, even when you turn to the very end of the book, Revelation chapter 22 and verse 16, Jesus says, I, Jesus, have sent mine angel to testify unto you these things in the churches. I am the root and offspring of David and the bright and morning star. The grand consummation of the history of Israel is the Davidic king who will reign forever from the throne of David. So that is all the rest of this Bible that we can see flowing out from these two early books. Now, from the start of Exodus, we are really taught in many ways how to read the Bible, because we are not going to rightly understand Exodus without reading and understanding Genesis. You can't, if say you have no knowledge of the Bible and you just pick up Exodus and you begin reading it, you're going to have quite a lot of questions, and you're going to have a lot of gaps, and you're going to have a lot of holes in your knowledge, and you're not going to properly understand what's being said here and why. And so that teaches us again about reading the Bible itself, that it all stands together, that it all has connection, that it all is moving from a beginning to an ending. And everything that is in it is important and contributing to that movement. Now, referring here to the descendants of Israel, the children, the sons of Israel that came into Egypt, the household, the family of Jacob, Moses also says, and that is covered in the last few chapters of Genesis, chapters 46 to 50. This is the migration of Jacob and his family into Egypt. And of course, Joseph was already there. Verses 2 to 4 give us just a listing of the sons of Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. So these are 11 sons, and we know that he had 12, but Joseph didn't come into Egypt with them. He was already there. And of course, that is explained in the very next verse number 5. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. So again, Joseph was already in Egypt, and of course, you're familiar with Genesis. You know why he was there. You know how that he got there. And you know how at the very end in Genesis chapter 50, when Joseph is speaking about how that God meant or planned or ordered all of these things to preserve the people of Israel alive for their inheritance. And why? Because of the promises that God made starting with Abraham. That's why. The household of Jacob amounted to 70 souls, we are told. And we will see from this beginning of Jacob's family in Israel to the growth of a people, of a nation. And the stress here is on the descendants of Jacob, his seed, 70 souls, all that came in to Egypt. Then verse 6, and Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. All the sons of Jacob died. Ultimately, we read of the death of Jacob before the end of the book of Genesis, and then we're told how they all died. All of that generation that came into Egypt with Jacob died. Well, that obviously would raise a question then. Well, what's going to become of that nation? If you had these fathers, these heads that began these tribes, and remember one of God's promises to Jacob that he was going to become a nation of tribes, a company of tribes, this multitudinous nation that God was going to make from him. Well, what's going to become of this nation? Jacob is gone. Joseph's gone. Reuben, Simeon, all of them, all of that generation that came in, they're gone. In other words, life is sort of just moving on there in Egypt. Well, verse number 7, and the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. So Moses adds that after the death of the original family that came into Egypt, the descendants of Israel multiplied and grew greatly. Now, of course, this is actually signaling to us the faithfulness of God, because God is obviously blessing this people even though they are in Egypt. Think about the prophecies that went before, the promises that went before. God spoke to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 to 16. And he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, thou shalt be buried in a good old age, but in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So before Isaac was ever born, before Jacob was ever born, these are the words that God spoke in covenant promise to Abraham concerning his seed, and here referencing that nation that would come from him. God spoke to Jacob in Genesis chapter 46, verses 2 to 4. And God spake unto Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here am I. And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. I will go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again, and Joseph shall put his hand upon thine eyes. So we've recently, in studying the Abrahamic covenant, we looked at sort of some of those personal, more immediate type of promises, like he's going to see Joseph again. But then there's also further future promises that he's going to bring Jacob back up out of Egypt. Well, he had told Abraham before this time that it would be 400 years before they come back out of Egypt. So obviously Jacob would not still be alive, but the promise is just as much alive, though Jacob has been dead for centuries when we begin reading here in verse 7 of Exodus chapter number 1. And then think of the words of Joseph in Genesis chapter 50, verses 24 and 25. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. So all of this was prophesied and promised beforehand. And the book of Exodus is simply connecting us to that and is beginning to show those things come to pass. Israel would go into a land that's not theirs. In that land, they would grow into a mighty and numerous nation. They would be heavily afflicted in slavery. They would be rescued and brought again to the land promised, all the way back to when Abraham first came into Canaan. Now, they're not enslaved yet, as we're reading in this first few verses of Exodus 1. They're not enslaved yet, but they're already threatened. After the death of that first generation, Israel would have been threatened through assimilation. I mean, it would be very easy for this people to have simply melted and disappeared in Egypt over centuries through intermarriage and all of those sort of things. But they settled in a very distinct land. Genesis 46:34 says, that ye shall say, thy servant's trade hath been about cattle from our youth even unto now, both we and also our fathers, that ye may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination unto the Egyptians. So the children of Israel, again, could have been threatened and were threatened with assimilation. It's not that uncommon to happen. And in fact, oftentimes when one nation would conquer another and carry away the people into captivity, that was the very goal. Essentially, we're going to obliterate this nation through assimilation with our people, that they'll no longer be a distinct identity. So they were certainly threatened with that after the death of that generation. But if we think about those warrior shepherd kings, centuries before, sort of took care of that problem. They created in the Egyptians a disgust with foreign shepherds, and that seems to be the indication. The Egyptians were not vegetarians, and they did keep animals of their own, but they detested foreign shepherds. And so as a result, the people remained separate. They grew into a nation because they maintained their identity in a land separate from the Egyptians. Well, this introduction to Exodus signals to us what is at stake in this book. God made a covenant with Noah that he would preserve this creation. And he's going to do so in order to fulfill his purpose of redemption. God later made a covenant with Abraham that he was going to make a new nation from him, not one of the 70 that was given there after the flood, after the days of Noah, that when the people of the earth grew and multiplied and were formed into nations. Not one of those, a new nation that he's going to make from Abraham. And he promised Abraham he's going to redeem that nation from Egypt, and that he's going to bless all the nations of the earth through that nation. So God's covenant promises are at stake. In other words, God, all these verses that we read just a little while ago, all these promises about what was going to happen with Israel, going into Egypt, coming up again. We saw that Abraham was given that promise. Jacob based decisions in his life off of that promise. Joseph, right before he died, is giving that promise and giving reassurance of that promise and making them covenant with him that they'll take up his bones back into the land of Canaan and not leave them there in Egypt. All of these things are at stake as we open up the book of Exodus. God's covenant promises are at stake. What will become of this nation when Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph are gone, and Israel is not in the land that is promised to them? And as we get through verse number 7, they're actually pretty happy. They're pretty prosperous. They're doing well in the land of Goshen in Egypt. But yes, even though the fathers may be gone, God is still here. And in this book, he reveals his name to Israel. His name and his word are what's on the line. And he acts for the sake of both in this book. So what do nomadic hostile shepherds, Egypt and ancient Israel thousands of years ago have to do with us today? Well, the God of Exodus is still God today. He is the same. His word to Abraham and Israel is still just as sure today as it was the day that he spoke it. And again, one of those primary lessons is that we can trust him. We can trust his word. And this book is a testament to the fact that he is faithful to his own word and his own name. Keeping and fulfilling these ancient promises also means the salvation today of all who believe, whether they're Jews or Gentiles. All right, that's all of the message for this morning. We will close with a hymn.
My Jesus, I love thee.